Okay. We're at 16 October. Dis&datInformation, welcome. We're continuing on with Andres Saenz de Sicilia's Subsumption book, Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and From the Critique of Reason to the Critique of Society. And we're up to chapter 4. I think we were up at, I think section 4. We weren't here yesterday, and it was just as well because apparently all of YouTube was down for a while. So there's that. And yes, I have been yammering a little bit about this. I do think that this is worth looking at. What Saenz de Sicilia is doing is seeing how sort of unfolding his model of subsumption onto a social scale, at the social scale. And I think that that's useful. Useful from a modeling point of view, useful for a variety of reasons. So, where we left off, I think, is section 4, subsection 4, chapter 4, mediating reproduction and development. In light of these criticisms, adequately theorizing the impact of capitalist subsumption on the social process demands avoiding two forms of closure. A diachronic form that would totalize that impact historically, and a synchronic form that would totalize it systemically. So, historically, systemically. Instead, if conceived openly, the dynamic of subsumption will be seen not to only affect, but also mediate the historical and systematic aspects of social reproduction, and bringing them into relation in the way that it implants a unique logic of social development within the structure of reproduction itself. Making real change a basic systemic presupposition rather than a contingency or nominal tendency. This is what generates the specific historical logic of quote-unquote uninterrupted disturbance proper to capitalist production, at the core of which is a complexity surrounding the relation of its being and becoming. So it accommodates, all of the different elements, the Kantian, the Hegelian, and the Marxian. Marx grapples with this complexity in a crucial passage from the Grundrisse, upon which the entire problem of closure can be seen to turn. Quote, "It must be kept in mind that the new forces of production and relations of production do not develop out of nothing, nor drop from the sky, nor from the womb of the self-posited idea, but from within and in antithesis to the existing development of production and the inherited traditional relations of property. While in the completed bourgeois system, every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois economic form, and everything posited is thus also a presupposition. This is the case with every organic system. This organic system itself, as a totality, has its presuppositions and its development to its totality, and its development to its totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs which it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. The process of becoming this totality forms a moment of its process, of its development." Footnote 112, close quote. Sorry. It is important to analytically distinguish the two levels of being and becoming operative here in order to grasp how their articulation exceeds Marx's own conscious presentation. Let me break here for a second, and you can refer to certain ideas about social ontology, for example. Back to the text. At the level of being, the mutual presupposition of relations and the positing of presuppositions are, Marx says, characteristic of every organic system or reproductive totality. That is, a systematic totality of relations that exists in and through the process of reproducing its subjective and objective conditions. It is in this way that the capitalist mode of production is, for Marx, a reproductive totality. Reproduction is the mode of its existence or composition. At the level of the system's becoming, capital is dependent on a mode of development that is also a negation or absorption of extant social forms, wealth, and practices, and the subordination of these to itself. Capital's becoming is based on subsuming social elements and reorganizing them through its own logic of reproduction. The difficulty with this organic model, however, lies in the idea of completion. The completed bourgeois system that Marx refers to is capital at the point at which it can reproduce itself and its conditions. The capitalist process of production, the capitalist process of production, therefore, is seen as a total connected process, i.e., a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other, the waged laborer. Footnote 113, close quote. Yet at the same time, capital can never reach a completed state of being because its own reproductive logic is based on an unceasing accumulation of new wealth. There's no simple capitalist reproduction. That is, without self-expansion, capital is not capital. Capital's circulatory movement is, echoing Hegel's description of dialectical development, a spiral, an expanding curve, not a simple circle. Footnote 114. The capitalist system always demands more, and as the most characteristically modern form of society, is in a perennial state of unrest. This means that capital's being is development. Its mode of existence is a ceaseless and insatiable moment of becoming. As Marx and Engels announce in the Communist Manifesto, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbances of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. Footnote 115. Yet it is never sufficiently developed, with each cycle of accumulation still inadequate compared to the next, so that it moves in contradictions which are constantly overcome, but just as constantly posited. Footnote 116. This dialectical slip between being and becoming is what grounds the capitalist system's openness as a historical rather than a natural and so closed organic system. Although in one sense, at least, this distinction ultimately comes down to relative speeds rather than absolute difference. And as a system whose living existence must be grasped in the articulation of reproduction development, recalling, as he argues in chapter 2, that this hyphenated pairing is the active or processual form of natural history. Now, the key to this articulation is the constitutive role of consumption. Because capitalist reproduction is never fully complete. It is in a continual process of becoming or development, the basic logical form of which may be fixed axiomatically in the general formula m-c-m prime, but whose material content is generated in variable and contingent ways by a constantly intensifying subsumption of social and material elements. This intensification or deepening of subsumption, as Echeverria describes it, has a progress of totalitarian reach, both extensive and intensive, as planetarization and technification, respectively, with no natural or logical state of completion. Footnote 117. Now, this means that capital is continually caught in the struggle over integration / transcendence, integration transcendence with labor as well as nature, a struggle which plays itself out primarily in the process of production, because it is in production that those elements most directly mediate capital's becoming and thus become moments of its own process, insofar as they determine its capacity to valorize itself and therefore to develop through accumulation. At the same time, however, the coordinates of this struggle far exceed production, because the social elements that capital strives to subsume in production are themselves shaped by a wide ensemble of factors, relations, and practices which traverse the entire social process, including spheres of social activity in which capitalist command has no formal authority, i.e., outside of the workplace. Marx hinted at this when he wrote that capital steps as if it were from its inner organic life into its external relations. Footnote 118. These external relations pertain to an entire compass of forms and practices that determine the compositional totality within which that inner organic life subsists and upon which it depends. In reality, then, capital's becoming is nothing but the expression of its successes and failures in the struggle over subsumption at a social scale. A lot there. Deconstructing the struggle and trajectory of development in terms of the real practices and forms of social being through which society reproduces itself is the basis for an open-ended investigation of capitalist subsumption, understood as a contested dynamic of transformation, a moving rather than a static contradiction. As Marx says, political economy perceives, discovers the root of the historical struggle and development. Footnote 119. Such a deconstruction is premised on the non-identity of capitalist reproduction and the socially reproductive totality, despite their historical interpenetration and the assumption that the interpenetration itself is the object of critical social research, of which capital as a mode of production forms just one aspect or layer. A lot there. Page 208. Marx himself, however, in reducing his treatment of this broader sense of reproduction, of social relations and their conditions, productive subjects and objective wealth, to the dynamics, the inner dynamics of capital's overall accumulation process, once again raises the threat of a theoretical closure that undermines the deconstructive reading of subsumption. There are various aspects to this provisional or tendential closure in Marx's critique of political economy. Michael Kratka refers to at least three heroic abstractions through which Marx constructed a complete and closed system of capitalist relations. That is, the abstraction from the diversity or variety of capitalism, the abstraction from the development or history of capitalism, and last but not least, the abstraction from the capitalist world system. Footnote 120. Shortall, Leibowitz, and Bonfeld also take up the problem of closure with reference to capital, but focus instead on the neutralization of the variable dimension of class struggle and the subjectivity of labor, which is suppressed in a functional economistic model of the social process. As Shortall explains, quote, while Marx describes in graphic detail how the rhythms of the accumulation of capital impose themselves and thereby regulate the conditions of the working class, he is still only concerned with the working class as object. In itself, as the simple aggregation of individual workers as an objective condition for capital's accumulation, the worker, now the working class, remains as mere object regulated by the rhythms of the objective laws of the dialectic of capital, footnote 121, or in Bonnefeld's account, quote, in Marx, there exists a glimpse of economic closure when he argues that the value of labor is solely determined by labor time necessary to reproduce labor power, a value which consists of moral and historical elements which are imposed on capital through the class struggle. This closed formation is surprising since the moral element mentioned by Marx relates to the permanent radical reproduction and production of the separation between capital and labor, and the permanent radical reproduction and revolutionizing of the natural conditions on which, in turn, capital depends at the same time. Footnote 122. The issue raised in all of these accounts is that in falling into an objectivism of economic laws, Marx's critique of political economy forecloses a theoretical comprehension of the active potential of labor, as well as other non-economic forces and practices to disrupt or resist capital's accumulation process, other than as an abstractly registered possibility. But this active element is nonetheless assumed insofar as the inner dynamic of capitalist subsumption on which the accumulation process rests. But this active element is nonetheless assumed insofar as the inner dynamic of capitalist subsumption on which the accumulation process rests presupposes a constant running up against that which lies beyond the closed organic totality, a totality whose closure is constantly placed into question and undone by this need, contested by the externality upon which its reproduction depends. As Leibowitz argues, there cannot be a self-reproducing totality in capital because the necessary presuppositions for capital are not all results of itself, but rather depend on something outside of capital as such. Footnote 123. Now, these arguments highlight a tension internal to Marx's discourse between what Karatani calls a structurally determined topos, T-O-P-O-S, topos, where subjectivity cannot freely intervene, and the necessary openness of the system to that which exceeds it, interrupts it, contests it, but ultimately acts as the substance through which it lives by subsuming it within its own life process. Footnote 124. Shortall cites theoretical exigencies as the reason for Marx's introduction of closure, suggesting that Marx adopted the standpoint of political economy and quote-unquote bracketed extra systematic factors in order to deconstruct bourgeois society's self-illusion and reveal the cloaked relations of domination that ground it. The objectification of the worker via primitive accumulation, commodification, and subsumption to capital in production. A lot there. For Shortall, however, the closure in Marx's discourse remains provisional, as opposed to the capital logic and the systematic dialectics interpretations, where this closure is methodologically absolutized with reference to the object of knowledge. Quote, the questions of class struggle, rupture, and crisis are always implicit in Marx's exposition in Capital. While Marx must provisionally close off such questions in order to develop his exposition of the dialectic of capital, he never severs them completely. They are always presupposed. Footnote 125, close quote. Marx's writings are thus marked by an ambiguity regarding capital's systematic completeness. As Krotka notes, the closure of the system is interrupted by constant deviations that are increasingly forceful, particularly with respect to the history of capitalism, so that, in fact, what appear to be digressions from pure logical expositions are crucial parts of his argument, pointing to the openings and systematic gaps of the capitalist mode of production, as well as to the logic of its inner development. Footnote 126. Let me break here for a second. And this idea of openings and systematic gaps is an interesting problem, as are aporia. Anyway, Schmidt, back to the text. Schmidt, echoing Adorno, similarly refers to the synthesis of systemic and anti-systemic impulses in Marx's thought. Quote, Marxian economics is a system and at the same time not a system, for what forms the totality of bourgeois society is equally that which pushes beyond it. As an eminent critic, Marx assumes that the relationships he investigates exist in pure form corresponding to their concept. But as a critic, he knows how little, not only in England in that period, that is the case. Footnote 127, close quote. At stake in this issue of provisional closure is the relation between the economic analytic, and the critical deconstructive aspects of Marxist discourse. That is, between the political economy and the critique. The former points to a functional totality of economic relations that constitute bourgeois societies, a structural unity, while the latter, critique, in deconstructing the apparent naturalness of the fetishized economic forms taken by the system, points toward the real processes, practices, and subjects that constitute but also exceed and resist the modes of social being generated by capital. Quote, the totality of social praxis that constitutes, suffuses, and contradicts the apparent objective logic of capital, unquote. Footnote 128. It is the excessive and actively resistant character of the latter totality that remains problematically ambiguous with respect to the provisionally closed organic system of capital. When Marx wrote to Lassalle that his work was at once an expose and by the same token a critique of the system, was the point to replace the system of bourgeois political economy with a truer, more transparent theoretical totality. Truer because denaturalized and demystified, shown to depend upon historically specific and therefore alterable conditions in which exploitation and destruction is revealed to be a generic part of its inner determination. Truer, okay. Or was the point, going further, to open up with something akin to what Benjamin called a, quote, constellation saturated with tensions, unquote, between the totalizing integrative movement of the system and the detotalizing and speculatively retotalizing transcendent movement of the resistant elements brought into its orbit, thus enabling a situated analysis of the ongoing practices and processes of class conflict that constitute social experience. Footnote 129. The ambiguity regarding the relation of the bourgeois system to its historical becoming is brought to the fore through the problem of subsumption, because subsumption is the key process that mediates the connection between the formal value representational surface of the capitalist economic system and the totality of social praxis upon which it is founded and which it takes as its substance. Footnote 130. What there? The excess that is bracketed by Marx's closure needs to be reintroduced here if we are to grasp subsumption at more than just a unilateral and automatic function of the formal accumulation process, which is the standpoint Marx's critique simultaneously adopted and aimed to deconstruct. Footnote 131. This, firstly, requires acknowledging the way in which the factors through which the entire process of accumulation begins. Most importantly, the value and productivity of labor power are politically, as well as socially, culturally, spatially, etc., determined by conflictual processes both within and beyond the domain of economic relations, and that these determinations constitute the terrain upon which the specific struggle over subsumption in production is played out. It's a lot there for just the first point. Secondly, this also means recognizing that the dynamic of subsumption is not only driven and shaped in its actualization by these concrete determinations, but at the same time recomposes and transforms them. The entire system of the production, circulation, and accumulation of value that moves through the dynamic of subsumption. The entire system of the production, circulation, and accumulation of value that moves through the dynamic of subsumption, therefore, has at its base this politically charged reciprocity, although it is registered within the economic logic of the accumulation process only as the variable aspect of labor power. One can abstract from the concrete historical dimensions of accumulation and domination for the purposes of theoretical clarification, but ultimately, there must be these must be reincorporated in order to critically comprehend the forces of composition, conflict, resistance, and rupture. Composition, conflict, resistance, and rupture animating the social process and subsisting through the sphere of economic relations because, quote, between equal rights, force decides, unquote. Footnote 132. The reciprocal relation of determination between the individual acts of subsumptive form-determination in production, and the consistency of the compositional totality thereby generates an open movement of historical development via the cycle of reproduction that cannot be grasped at the level of a hermetically closed logical economic system. Section 5, subsection 5, chapter 4, subjectivation, and living labor. Reintroducing the variability of factors animating the dynamic of subsumption and the historical movement of reproduction-development means, in the first place at least, giving theoretical life to the subjectivity and action of labor, which in Marx's discourse continually appears, but which is just as constantly repressed by the provisional closure of the systematic standpoint. For Marx, labor must be understood to be variable and active in two senses, corresponding to the two poles of its commodity status. The variability of its economic value, which is correlated to the basic level of subsistence as determined by moral and historical factors, what the worker receives from capital, and the variability of its use value, which corresponds to the level of its productivity for capital, determined in the struggle over subsumption in production, what capital receives from the worker. Both of these factors are indissolubly bound up with the dynamic of subsumption, particularly in its real form, and constitute sites of resistance and conflict, shaping the overall dynamic of accumulation as well as its effects on the social process as a whole. You know, the bottle you bring with you on your Amazon delivery. What is key here is how the resistance of labor, organized or otherwise, exceeds, disturbs, and reacts back upon the system's internal logic of accumulation, whilst nonetheless being bound to it as a condition of the worker's existence. Or, in other words, how the reproduction of the human society considered as a practical totality and the reproduction of capital considered as an economic totality dialectically interpenetrate and unfold in their contradictory movements. Footnote 133. These two opposed logics of reproduction constitute a further final moment of the subsumptive relation, played out at the level of the social totality and completing the series of opposition, contradiction, and subsumption between capital and labor. Number one, use value slash value, right? Use value, big V value, right? Number two, labor process valorization process, labor process slash valorization process. And number three, social reproduction process and capital reproduction process, social reproduction process slash capitalist reproduction process. In Marx's Capital, however, labor's reproduction is presented as a systematic necessity, treated in abstractly functionalist terms as a calibrating principle of accumulation, the absolutely necessary condition for capitalist production. Footnote 134. In both its productive and unproductive moments, labor's activity seems to be fully absorbed within the capitalist totality. Quote, from the standpoint of society, then, the working class, even when it stands outside the direct labor process, is just as much an appendage of capital as the tireless instruments of labor are. Even its individual consumption is, within certain limits, a mere aspect of capital's reproduction. Close quote, footnote 135, the company picnic, maybe. Back to the text. Marx demonstrates this in his reproduction schemas at the end of Volume 2 of Capital, in which the working class purchases the means to reproduce itself back from the capitalist class with its wages, whose consumption consequently appears within capital's life process as one of its essential conditions of possibility, the means of realizing surplus value. Marx therefore brackets the independent existence of living labor, reducing its reproduction to the functions it fulfills for the reproduction of capital. In one sense, this is entirely in keeping with the standpoint of the capitalist totality, which reduces the worker to nothing more than labor in its being for itself, being dash for dash itself. Footnote 136. Moving beyond the partial perspective of those certain limits mentioned above by Marx is, however, crucial for opening the system to a qualitative dimension beyond capital's unilateral control and direct interest. Such a move is necessary because although the capitalist must cede a wage to the worker in order to ensure his or her reproduction, the capitalists do not directly oversee that reproduction, that is, the worker's eating, sleeping, leisure, caring for others. Unlike the active exchange, which affects the formal metamorphosis of money wages into means of subsistence and commodity capital into money capital, the act of unproductive consumption itself, which Marx described in 1857 as the destructive antithesis to production, is a moment of practice which occurs outside of the circuit of capitalist accumulation. This is why Marx argues that it actually belongs outside economics. It doesn't necessarily, so I would add. Anyway, footnote 137. Interesting note, Ben Fine notes the theoretical space opened by this caesura in capital control, and worth thinking about at some other moment, I suppose. Page 214. This peculiar status of consumption within the system, as both independent of direct capitalist command, but simultaneously effet social, is vital for thinking how the dynamic of subsumption operates at the level of reproduction, i.e., in the contradiction between society conceived as a practical totality and society conceived as an abstract economic totality. This is because the unproductive consumption through which the labor power commodity is reproduced physiologically as a bundle of nerves, muscles, organs capable of abstract social labor is also a process of production that involves the qualitative formation of the potentially resistant subjectivity which capital strives to both utilize and subjugate in its mission to self-valorize, what you do in your other screens at work. There is thus an invisible thread of continuity linking the struggles over production with the reproductive processes that lie outside the economic domain, which is to say, linking labor's use value and value aspects. As an extensive materialist feminist literature has forcefully argued, it is thus crucial to mitigate Marx's tendency towards value reductionism when it comes to the question of labor's subjectivation, labor's subjectivation through consumption, a reductionism that contrasts sharply with his vivid accounts of subjectivation through subsumption in production. And this is the culture question, I would assume, and to situate in the conflicts over capitalist subsumption both within and beyond the bourgeois economic totality, a totality whose self-sufficient unity is an ideological illusion. Footnote 138. The process of consumption cannot, of course, be dissociated from the economic logic determining the production of the objects and services through which it is realized, or from the circulatory flows determining the distribution and accessibility of those objects, but it must be recognized that the qualitative dimensions of subjectivation play a crucial systemic role that cannot be registered in quantitative value terms alone. A theoretical mediation is required that correlates economic movements with the underlying non-economic processes that shape the subjectivity of those who labor for and against capital. In this respect, considerations of the role of the state are essential, given that capital's mode of existence is founded on an inner drive to negate the conditions of labor power's reproduction by reducing them to an absolute minimum while extracting the absolute maximum, surplus labor, footnote 139. Marx shows that capital would indeed have begun annihilating the working class in Britain had the latter not resisted and the state not ultimately intervened to secure their reproduction by legislative means, corn laws et al. Here too, the labor laws as well. Here too, the state presents a sphere of social action external to the organic system of bourgeois production, if not independent of it, and yet at the same time, absolutely presupposed by it. The principal problematic surrounding the subjectivity of labor is that of the relation of living workers to their own labor activity, a relation at stake in so many of the key moments of Marx's critique, that is, original accumulation, fetishism, abstract labor, personification, commodification, subsumption. For Marx, this relation first emerges as a problem by virtue of the dissociation of the worker from their own labor, arising from the historically specific conditions of separation in which capitalism predominates. Quote, already the fact that it is labor which confronts capital as subject, i.e., the worker only in his character as labor himself, should open the eyes. This alone, disregarding capital, already contains a relation of the worker to his own activity, which by no means the natural one, but which itself already contains a specific economic character. Close quote, footnote 140. Marx explores this relation at the level of the commodity, where the labor power commodity is the bearer of labor as use value, and production, where concrete labor is the bearer of abstract labor. Labor power commodity is the bearer of labor as use value, and production where concrete labor is the bearer of abstract labor. But what exactly happens into this relation at the level of reproduction, where the living workers are the practical bearers of capitalist social production process. Footnote 141. At this level, as Leibowitz argues, what underlies the struggle against capital and drives beyond capital is the contradiction between the worker's self and her conditions of life. Footnote 142. That is, the capacity of living labor as individual and speculatively as a class to assert its own being in manner that opposes, exceeds, and transcends its status as the mere bearer of a substance that is seized upon by capital in production. Footnote 143. What happens during your breaks? Here, back to the text, sorry. Here, where the worker no longer belongs to himself but the capital, a specific set of conflicts and mediations are in play. The latter are, however, dependent upon the obverse moment of the worker reproducing their own capacities, as well as the reproduction of the overall context in which labor exists as a substance for capital, both of which introduce distinct but ultimately connected sets of conflicts and mediations that are irreducible to struggles in production. The overall articulation of all of these processes within a capitalist framework is defined by the practical dissociation of the capacity to act, to shape reality according to a conscious plan, from the living bearer of that capacity, the subject of that plan, the worker. This is why Marx asserts that, quote, at the level of material production, of the life process in the realm of the social, for that is what the process of production is, we find the same situation that we find in religion at the ideological level, namely the inversion of subject into object and vice versa. Close quote. Footnote 144. This moment of inversion is built into the dynamic of subsumption, driving it and at the same time shaping it, thus implying a constant and changing process of subjectivation, or as we might even say, desubjectivation. On one side, the productive subject enters into the production process where it struggles to assert itself against the capitalist command that would reduce it to a mere object as the bare capacity to work and a resource to be exploited. On the other, the subject enters the contiguous sphere of consumption where its intentionality faces no direct capitalist control, but is nonetheless constrained by those material facts which have been decided upon in production. Let me break here and say, well, is that what price cost does? Anyway, back to the text. This movement of de and re-subjectivation takes on a distinctively new configuration where the dynamic of subsumption asserts itself in production in its real form. With real subsumption, the connection between the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of labor is both intensified and qualitatively transformed by the fact that the two circuits are not simply bound together through mutual economic dependence, as formal subsumption implies, but materially interpenetrate at the point at which the products, i.e. use values, resulting from a properly capitalist mode of production, enter into the consumption of the working class. There's a lot there. Marx theorized this in terms of the relation between real subsumption and relative surplus value, which can only be produced once the goods consumed by the working class lower in value, thereby reducing the necessary part of the working day. Let me break here for a second and say, well, this is obviously a second rather than a first moment, right? It's some sort of whatever contingent moment, and in that sense, well, maybe not contingent, successive moment, perhaps. Anyway, back to the text. As the effects of real subsumption are socialized, in passing through mediated circuits of reproduction, they assert themselves economically in terms of the value of labor power. The effects of this movement cannot be fully grasped in economic terms alone, however, as they concern not only a transformation of the material and social mode of production, the means and matter of labor, but also, as a result, entirely transformed products, which provide the objective social context in which the subjectivity of the working class is formed as well as realized. Footnote 145. Here, the development of the producer subject and the development of the capitalist economy interpenetrate as the density of capitalist subsumption intensifies. It generates decisive effects in terms of human needs and capacities, just as it does at the level of total social capital. Quote, the production of relative surplus value, i.e., production of surplus value based on the increase and development of the productive forces, requires the production of new consumption, requires that the consuming circle within circulation expands as did the productive circle previously. Firstly, quantitative expansion of existing consumption. Secondly, creation of new needs by propagating existing ones in a wide circle. Thirdly, production of new needs and discovery and creation of new use values. In other words, so that the surplus labor gained does not remain a merely quantitative surplus, but rather constantly increases the circle of qualitative differences within labor, hence of surplus labor, makes it more diverse, more internally differentiated. Close quote, footnote 146. The subjectivity of labor evolves in parallel with the expanded development of capital, but is not reduced to it, generating a nonlinear, dynamic, irreducible to the reproduction of capital or labor alone, but grounded reciprocally in the interactive movement of the two cycles. The interconnection posited here between the composition of capital and the composition of the worker is therefore bound up with the question of productive forces in capitalist technology. As demonstrated in the previous chapter, Marx clearly identifies a strong correlation between the technical dimension of real subsumption and the formation of the worker's subjectivity. In this sense, the dynamic of capitalist subsumption moves contradictorily with respect to human labor. On the one hand, it constantly strives to increase the productive powers of labor through technical transformation of the labor process and development of productive forces, whilst on the other hand, it represses, as a condition of this technical transformation being at the same time a means to increase the valorization of capital, the subjective dimension of living labor that asserts itself in the conscious regulation of its metabolism with nature. So, this conscious regulation is displaced by managerial, scientific, and automated forms of workplace control, which determine the realization of labor over and often against the subjective intentions of the workforce. The contradiction, however, appears in a one-sided, mystified form, so long as the technical economic aspects of real subsumption pertaining to the reproduction of capital obscure and displace its socio-natural aspects pertaining to the concrete form of living labor's social reproduction. As Echeverria argues, quote, the effectiveness of the instrumental field is not reducible to its productivity. This is only its quantitative determination, the degree to which the global instrument enables the subject to dominate or transform nature. Effectiveness is the qualitative content of productivity. It establishes an entire defined horizon of possibilities of form for the global object of production and consumption. In this sense, in presenting certain possibilities of form and leaving aside others, in being specialized in a determinate axiological direction, the global effectiveness itself possesses a particular form, which rests upon the technological structure of the instrumental field. Close quote, footnote 147. Grasped as a qualitative totality, the process through which society reproduces itself not only endows the objects and in turn the subjects of practical life with a specific form, but also shapes the form-giving process itself, form-giving process itself. Reproduction can thus be seen as a cycle of quote-unquote self-activity through which the subject transforms its own social being via the mediation of its activity upon the object. Footnote 148. The dynamic of capitalist subsumption introduces a unique logic of domination internal to this form of historical activity by dissociating the capacity to determine the form given to the product of labor from the laboring subject that produces it. With real subsumption, this dissociation becomes a material-technical fact, insofar as the objective structure of the instrumental field increasingly presupposes, within certain limits, social reproduction on a capitalist basis. Footnote 149. This is Saenz argued that technology has become the great vehicle of reification in its most mature and effective form, a thought taken up by Kroll as the imperative to transform the critique of political economy into a critique of political technology. Footnote 150. Real subsumption, therefore, operates as a mechanism of indirect capitalist regulation of social reproduction, and so by implication of subjectivation, that complements and supports the direct forms of capitalist regulation active in production, although this not without a certain degree of practical ambivalence, given that the transformations of the instrumental field affected by capital function necessarily, but not exclusively, reinforce exploitation and accumulation. Other uses and abuses of that field may indeed be possible. Subsection 6. The generative dynamic. The key to grasping the openness of the dynamic of subsumption at the level of the social reproduction process lies in the double character of subsumption per se, as at once a formal metamorphosis and at the same time an underlying process of material synthesis. Marx's analysis of subsumption in production offers an incredibly rich theorization of the processes and techniques of material synthesis through which the valorization of capital is effected within a capitalist-controlled labor process. Yet Marx only conceptualizes the transformative dynamic resulting from that synthesis, which is not only driven by class conflict, but also exceeds production and is mediated through the entire social process from the standpoint of an abstract logic of total social capital's expanded reproduction. This leads Marx to characterize the dynamic of subsumption functionalistically when he claims that a specifically capitalist mode of production, i.e. real subsumption, arises and develops spontaneously on the basis of the formal subsumption of labor under capital. As DAS, rightly notes, however, the transition to real subsumption with associated technological change is not automatic, but is a protracted process mediated by class struggle, which occurs in the context of a whole host of factors, including capitalist state interventions. Footnote 152. It is the conflicts between living agents, both capitalists and workers, unfolding amongst all of those economic and extra-economic factors that ultimately determines how the dynamic of subsumption acts upon the social and material factors of production, and therefore how it reshapes the reproduction process as a whole. Footnote 153. These conflicts are basic to capitalist reproduction, and therefore the dynamic is always active. However, the latter cannot be translated into a deterministic teleology or schema of material development, because that development is only ever, that's what I meant by a successive, is only ever a secondary effect of the struggle over valorization and accumulation, which is the real content of capitalist development. Footnote 154. Capital must accumulate in order to be capital. But how it does so, and the wider material effects of this imperative, cannot be specified at such a high level of abstraction. To translate this injunction into a technical teleology is to mystify, indeed, mystify the real motivations revealed by the theory of capitalist subsumption, as Echeverria argues, quote, the theory of subsumption conceives of the apparently natural development of modern technology together with that which would be, on one side, its essential effect, the perfection of the productivity of labor, and on the other, its incidental effect, the destruction of the producer subject as well as of nature, as a process far from proceeding from the spontaneously progressive need to apply the advances of science to production, is rather set loose by a regressive social necessity, that of perfecting the exploitation of the labor force. Close quote. Footnote 155. The dynamic of subsumption does not thus primarily denote technological change, although this is its most pronounced and tangible manifestation, but rather expresses the multiple strategies capitalists deploy in their attempts to maximize exploitation and reproduce their capital in expanded form. There is no doubt that capitalist subsumption is characterized by immense advances in the technical complexity and capacities of production, at least at certain points in global chains of production. Yet, it can be just as well happen that, particularly where the cost of labor is low, the dynamic inhibits or excludes technical advances in production. It's an uneven development, as property owners can respond to class struggles against formal subsumption by way of reinforcing formal subsumption and or introducing hybrid subsumption, which includes mercantile-usury-based exploitation. Footnote 156. Thus arguing against the widespread assumption touched on by Chakrabarty that real capitalism means real subsumption. Doss holds that it is the absence of the logic of real subsumption that contributes to the specificity of these less developed societies as capitalist societies. Footnote 157. The variability with which processes of subsumption affect the social relations and material configuration of production within the frame of global capitalist accumulation thus destabilizes any teleological interpretation of the dynamic driving those processes, rather than guaranteeing progression to a specified technological state. The subsumptive dynamic operates flexibly to inscribe productive units, whether individual enterprises, regions, industries, etc., within an internally differentiated economic totality characterized by diverse strategies of valorization. Thus, whilst the dynamic of subsumption presupposes unceasing social transformation, and where real subsumption is in effect, brings about a complete and constantly repeated revolution in material conditions, the transformative force of the dynamic cannot be adequately comprehended at the level of a closed, logical, systemic discourse. A lot there. This is because it is not a programmatic repetition, but an expansive, changing historical movement. Here, the model of knowledge based on an organic totality, the special laws that regulate the origin, existence, development, and death of a social organism and its replacement by a higher one breaks down, and Marx's caution regarding the limits of the dialectical form of presentation becomes salient. Footnote 158. The importance of consumption, considered in the widest possible sense, and processes of subject formation in determining the conflicts over subsumption, and therefore the course of historical development, points not only to the internal incompleteness of capital as a system, but to its extensive dependency on another system, that of the life of labor, not to mention the presence of a political institutional apparatus at both the national, international, and transnational levels, which supports and guarantees the reproduction of its basic premises. Capitalist society, understood in this way, is not a single systematic totality, but must be comprehended as an at least double-sided, contradictory articulation of opposed but interlocking reproductive systems with conflicting logics of existence. In the course of its own realization, then, the accumulative logic of the bourgeois system must interact with historically specific conditions, practices, and institutions in order to satisfy its own logically required conditions of expanded reproduction. The concrete content of this interaction is generated both in its intensive and extensive movement, the deepening of control and productive efficiency in those zones of the social process already entwined within the circuits of capital, along with the colonization of new spaces, populations, practices, and resources. In both of these cases, however, there is no accomplished or normal state of subsumption, and the possible paths of development are as vast as they are uneven. The interpenetration between capital's logic and capital's historical development can therefore be derived no more from a closed logical system than from a, quote, general historico-philosophical theory, as Marx argued in his famous letter to the editors of Autosevyentsya Zapitsky. Footnote 159. The dynamic of subsumption always points beyond its linear logical structure and demands a critical engagement with the conjunctural specificity of social forms and struggles. Marx's later writings and correspondence indicate an increasing recognition of the limits of systematic closure and the need for empirical sensitivity, as well as a methodological orientation towards the spheres of externality that disrupt the self-sufficiency of capital as an organic system and place the question of development, which is implied in and in turn implies reproduction, firmly in the field of a complex amalgam of realities whose conjunction is contested. Let me break here for a second. Yeah, isn't that the need for creches or childcare in the workplace? Whatever. Anyway, back to the text. Marx arrived at this standpoint, Tomba argues, by making an idea of the development of the forces of production interact with the concrete responses of history. That is to say, the histories of the struggles that, interacting with the atemporal historicity of capital, co-determine its history. Footnote 160. An open, interactionist approach to the way in which the dynamic of subsumption connects production and reproduction shatters all stagist and teleological assumptions regarding capitalist historical development. Through this perspective, more and less developed, more developed and less developed regions do not appear as more or less complete. They are simply those regions whose reproduction has been subject to a greater duration and or intensity of formation by capital's logic of accumulation, including the sense in which the very spatial basis of that reproduction is accordingly altered and thus modifies the regional character in question. For example, from intersocial to international to transnational modes of differentiation and interaction, i.e., the supply chain or trade or transportation, whatever. Back to the text. The development of so-called advanced regions therefore bears more traces of this formation, where the processes of subsumption, specifically of commodification and capitalist production techniques, are deeper, more entrenched within the reproductive logic of the social body. Footnote 161. This is the sense in which Marx talks of capital driving beyond all traditional, confined, complacent, encrusted satisfaction of present needs and reproduction of old ways of life. That these are emptied of teleological significance should not be taken to imply that pre-existing practices and forms of social existence are simply erased or replaced by fully developed capitalist forms of life. Capital, as the accumulation of abstract wealth, posits no use-value content directly, as Echeverria contends. Quote, indispensable as it is to the concrete existence of modern social wealth, Capitalist mediation cannot assert itself as an essential condition for its existence, nor can it synthesize a genuinely new figure for it, the totality shaped by it, even when it really does penetrate the process of reproduction and is expanded as one of the technical conditions of this process, is the result of a forced totalization. It maintains a contradictory polarity, is constituted by the relations of integration or subordination of natural wealth under a form imposed on it. Footnote, close quote, footnote 163. The dynamic of subsumption introduces a logic of social recomposition into the production process, but it does so only by wrapping itself around, redeploying, and reinventing those figures of life which it encounters and runs up against. In doing so, these aspects of the social process are mutated, deformed, suppressed, or intensified, inverted, or abolished. In whatever way the gradual and progressive reshaping of this content unfolds, it nevertheless does so in a manner that depends upon and works within this social substance and its crystallized historical elements which form the indispensable medium of capital's realization. So we're at 225, and we need tomorrow to get to... Oh, we're almost done. My goodness. All righty then. We will finish this in the next couple of minutes. My apologies. The dynamic of subsumption introduces a logic of social recomposition into the production process, but it does so only by wrapping itself around, redeploying, and reinventing those figures of life which it encounters and runs up against. In doing so, these aspects of the social process are mutated, deformed, suppressed, or intensified, inverted, or abolished. In whichever way the gradual and progressive reshaping of this content unfolds, it nevertheless does so in a manner that depends upon and works within this social substance and its crystallized historical elements, which form the indispensable medium of capital's realization. As the mediating role of capital within the reproduction process becomes socially dominant, it progressively recodes the practical significance and social actuality of those elements functionally form determining them according to the social logic of abstract accumulation. Capital thus fosters an ever greater dependency upon its accumulative mediation, which superimposes itself upon and subsumes the use-value dimension of social life, giving rise Castillo-Mendoza's weave of articulations as it reshapes the economic and technical basis of reproduction in a process that is both globally integrative and locally generative. Footnote 164. This is something Giacomo Maramo has emphasized. Arguing against the idea that capital is a purely homogenizing force, he has claimed that even the current phase of mondialization, globalization, is characterized by an ambivalent structure, signaled by the paradoxical coexistence of two aspects: technical scientific uniformity and ethical cultural differentiation. Footnote 165. In this sense, we can analytically separate and critically think together the forms of direct regulation integral to the dynamic of capitalist subsumption: commodification, supervision, technification, and those locally determined ideological and epistemic forms, structures of law, politics, violence, and pleasure, etc., with which the dynamic interacts, giving rise to the diverse realizations of capitalist social reproduction, capitalist social reproduction, and the differential distribution of economic functions at a global level. In so-called advanced regions, then, the subsumptive dynamic can simply be seen to have penetrated the elementary civilizationary substratum of reproduction with a greater density generating a deeper process of conflictual development marked by this contradictory polarity. This indicates, however, no greater proximity to either the perfection or supersession of that mediating dynamic, because that which we have come to know as capitalist society and culture is only an effect of this contradiction in its unfolding and deepening, the overall development of which lacks a coherent, holistic, or internally programmatic logic. That is, a developmental logic that could be given purely either at the cellular or organic level. This practical incoherence of accumulation and its subsumptive mechanisms is especially evident in capital's propensity to produce non-developments in tandem with its immense technical advances, and in its most extreme expressions, non-reproduction, that is, surplus population, crisis, environmental destruction, war, and death. The tankers dump grain into the oceans to manipulate prices. Entire towns lie uninhabited, and the cost of life-saving medication is arbitrarily inflated whilst human populations are denied the right to reproduce for lack of property or exploitability, are all testaments to the brute fact summarized in the general law of capitalist accumulation, that capital, whilst commanding the greatest productive powers yet known to human civilization, resolves them in the blind compulsion to incessantly reproduce social reality as a scene of absolute artificial scarcity. Footnote 166. Kind of very current. At the same time, however, the dynamic of subsumption cannot give rise to new means, needs, and forms of intercourse which point beyond the limited framework of capitalist modes of reproduction. The struggle over and against subsumption is not only a struggle to protect those subjective and objective elements that have not yet been absorbed, but also struggle to redeem those that bear the deepest scars of this society, to provide them with new forms and functions within social reality by giving that reality itself a new form. Quote, "It is as ridiculous to yearn for a return to that original fullness," Marx reminds us, "as it is to believe that with this complete emptiness, history has come to a standstill." Close quote, footnote 167. Now we are at the conclusion of this chapter, subsection 7. At stake, and it's only a couple more pages, so bear with me here. At stake in the conceptualization of capitalist subsumption on a social scale is the conflict of two opposed and contradictory logics of reproduction, vying to determine the possibilities of social action and thereby the course of historical development. As a virulent mediation, capital imposes itself upon and within the social reproduction of living labor and its life world, interrupting the practical correspondence between production and consumption with its abstract productivist agenda. In this way, Marx notes, only capital has subjugated historical progress to the service of wealth by displacing the logics of form determination proper to the multitude of social elements and reproductive configurations drawn into the orbit of capital's life process and subjecting them to the exigencies of accumulation. Footnote 168. It's a lot there. The process of displacement, absorption, and formation, however, demarcates a field of tension marked by struggle and contestation, a process that in the course of its own realization is torn between the two opposed imperatives, that is, production for the sake of living, or living for the sake of production. The struggle is not only over the possibility, degree, quality, and balance of reproduction, but also over the development and transformation of that which is reproduced. But if reproduction and development are both given, the question is, how and to what end do they occur? Here is where the dynamic of subsumption comes into force as a key concept. enabling the boundaries of integration/transcendence to be drawn within which the conflict over the form determination of the social process itself plays out. This is a contested process of transformation that is far from complete, total, or absolute in its social reach and effects, but that rather constitutes the base of the ongoing conflicts characterizing the reality towards which a theory of capitalist domination must orient itself. A critical engagement with this reality must remain open to the complexity and changeability of the particular forms of command and exploitation in production. Equally, it must remain open to the complexity and changeability of the relation between those discrete sites of subsumption and the compositional totality that conditions and is conditioned by them. The entire weave of articulations regulating the force field within which these struggles play out. Not there. Here, this theory of subsumption must mitigate the systemic impulses to totalization that would enact closure upon the process either diachronically, as the historical completion of labor in society's real subsumption, or synchronically, as the reproductive self-sufficiency and unity of a logically complete capitalist totality, right? Fully automated, luxury, right? Anyway, back to the text. Rejecting such closure opens the way for a far more fruitful engagement with an actively disputed social reality. In contribution to such an engagement, the idea of a dynamic of subsumption can be deployed in order to make sense of the specific forms, regulatory mechanisms, and general configurations of domination, shaping that reality in dispersed and varied ways. Sensitivity to the fluidity and incompleteness of the dynamic also imminently indicates further spheres of critical engagement, not only intensively at more concrete levels of empirical and historical engagement, but across other social sites and logics that modulate and co-determine the forms and motions taken by the reproductive process. Most obviously, politics and state power, racialization, and gender. Footnote 169. We're almost at the end. Registered at this level, capitalist subsumption takes on a third form, subsequently to number one, subsumption via commodification, and number two, subsumption in production, and corresponding to three, the subsumption of the social reproduction process under the process of capitalist accumulation. In this last form, the opposition between use value and value contained in the commodity, and the opposition of the labor process and the valorization process synthesized in production develop into the opposition between the two principal dimensions of reproduction in modernity. That concern with the production and consumption of material wealth that sustains the historical existence of human civilization, what Echeverria terms the quote-unquote natural form of social reproduction, and that concerned with the production and accumulation of abstract wealth, expanded capitalist reproduction, footnote 170, lot there. Like the other dyads, these two aspects form a contradictory unity in which a relation of subsumption overdetermines the relation between the opposed poles. At each successive level of mediation and concretion, the capitalist pole strives to subsume, control, and ultimately refound the material dimension proper to living labor. These two modes of comprehending the social reproduction process as a systematic totality do not, however, form an exhaustive ontological distinction. They do not correspond to two realities, but are posed by Marx as the basis for his deconstruction of political economy and the ideology of equilibrium and liberty that arises spontaneously from capitalist market social relations. A lot there. Insofar as Marx's critical theory is anti-functionalist, it is because it destroys the apparent coherence, stability, and naturalness of capital as an organic system by demonstrating the tension of this system with the other system, that of the production, circulation, and consumption of wealth. in its natural form, a system which is, as argued in Chapter 2, already constituted a biplanar tension between its social and natural levels of existence. As capital strives to subsume productive activity under its command and logic, it progressively internalizes and transforms the content of this human substratum, its substance. Yet, as the crucial mediating point of transition between the two poles, subsumption occurs within a given context, the reproductive framework that unites both aspects in a contradictory totality. It is this framework, in all its concrete historical determination and possibilities that is revealed by the deconstruction of the apparent capitalist totality, footnote 171. Consequently, what is to be understood is the actuality of the subsumptive dynamic beyond, although not in separation from, the purely economic, and in light of the multiple relations of power, collectivity, opposition, and action through which the dynamic is constituted within a social process marked by tension and conflict. At this level, the actualization of the dynamic, the subsumptive dynamic, reveals itself to be dependent upon a specific configuration of economic and political relations, forcing the question of political form and, crucially, of the unity of economic powers and state powers, which act as the basis for the constitution and reproduction of capitalist domination. This is implicit in the realization of the dynamic on a social scale and points to the need to elaborate the links between changes in the capitalist labor process and changes in class composition, in political structures, in the role of the capitalist state, in education as much as the economy, and in interstate relations, footnote 172. Crucially, the state here emerges as the arbiter of class struggle and ultimately as the unifying power that guarantees the correspondence of the reproductive cycles of capital and of living labor, stabilizing and synchronizing their contradictory unity, as well as regulating their perceived non-instrumentally. The state and its geopolitical foundations constitute a further site of reproduction-development that is equally subject to historical transformation and reinvention. This site is drawn back into the dynamic of capitalist subsumption just as much as it regulates and enables it. For, whereas previous historical forms of political power, previous historical forms of political power determine production in capitalist society, production and competition uniquely shape the material and economic basis of political institutions and relations. Now, this is particularly evident in light of the increasing spatial disjunction between the reproduction of capital, labor, and political form in the shape of the state. If political form structures the spatial and juridical basis for reproduction, the technical, logistical, and communicative transnationality of capital increasingly undermines the capacity of the state to affirm itself as the dominant agent of that form, suggesting a fluidity and ambivalence within the reproductive configuration at the level of its spatial unity and coherence. This points to the need for a less static and far more multiplicitous conception of the powers traversing and regulating the movement of the subsumptive processes that form the vertebral column of modernity, recalling Foucault's assertion that society is in reality the juxtaposition, the link, the coordination, and also the hierarchy of different powers that nevertheless remain in their specificity. Footnote 174. The theory of a dynamic of subsumption offers a perspective from which to think the presence of capitalist domination within this dense constellation of powers as the central moving contradiction around which all other oppositions and conflicts within the social process turn. This should not be considered as a unilateral hierarchy of influences, but as an open framework through which to think the combination of multiple forms of exploitation and resistance within a practical reproductive totality. breaking with the linear exposition of subsumption forms at the analytical level of reproduction and deploying a dynamic conception of capitalist development in its place is, in this way, as essential to a coherent understanding of the emergence of capitalist production as it is to grasping its current composition and the possibilities of action imminent to it. Whew. Finally, to the end of chapter 4, right? Saenz de Sicilia on subsumption. We will have a concluding thing tomorrow on the next day, on our next little session. And I want to note, of course, what we've been looking at is Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and Marx, from the Critique of Reason to the Critique of Society by André Saenz de Sicilia. And we are, close to the end. We have a very brief conclusion, as I think you can tell, which we can end with tomorrow on time, and if necessary, for things like office hours, etc. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you got something out of it. I did. It helped clarify many things for me, some of which I will probably actually ask Saenz de Sicilia at some particular moment, but we will get to the end and perhaps have a better sense of that. So we will, as you can tell, let me thank you for your attention. And I will end the live stream